some intervention at the point of each person's creation.
Do you know about the Darwinian theory that it's about individual variation being selected? There has to be individual variation or Darwinism wouldn't work.
What also seems to be shown in the scientific evidence is that mutations die out. And we don't have good evidence of positive mutations being the ones that are then built on, because if they're a mutation, they're alone. So in order for something to rise up and have more of it, you need to have a good base to choose from. For example, a recessive gene in a person. Both parents may have brown eyes, and yet a child may have blue eyes. And that's because there's enough of the gene in their ancestors to have brought out that recessive gene.
And that's evidence against evolution?
I think that helps to show the individual nature of each person. That God created us with genes, with DNA, and that He will even use that to show His creative element in each person. The fact that you can have two people, a man and a woman, could have 13 children, 16 children, and each one is completely distinct from one another. That shows that even though they came from a common parentage, that yet there's still a creative element for each one of those human beings.
Do you actually know what Darwin's theory of natural selection is?
I think I know enough, because it gets pounded into us by those who simply won't allow for other information, that don't want other information to come forward.
I won't do any pounding, but just let me tell you what it is. There is individual variation. Every individual, apart from monozygotic twins, is different from every other individual. That's absolutely fundamental to the Darwinian theory. Now, what happens is that among that variety of individuals, some survive better than others, some reproduce better than others. That's how we get evolution. You couldn't have evolution unless there was individual variation. You must not keep thinking that because there's individual variation, that's somehow evidence against evolution.
So I come back to you, and why do you reject the idea that there is a creator who's involved in the creation of human beings, whether it was the initial creation and then he left, or is involved in the creation of each human being who's ever lived on Earth?
Well, as I've said, there are plenty of ways in which God could be involved in creation of the universe, even creation of life, but Darwinian natural selection demands individual variation. That's why you must stop using individual variation as evidence against evolution. It's evidence for evolution.
Once I was going through the Smithsonian Natural History Museum with dear relatives of mine, and one of them was a severely handicapped little girl who can't do anything for herself. She can't talk, she can't walk, she can't feed herself, she can barely sit up. And when one of the people I was with turned to me and said, "Do you believe in evolution?" And I said, "I think this little girl is a perfect example of why evolution is wrong. Because here's someone who cannot take care of herself, and yet she has a spirit. She's not just a material being." And that's one difference I find between the ideology of Darwinism and evolution and those who believe in a loving God, is the idea of a spirit and a soul that is not material, and it's something that it makes us distinct from animals.
Do you think that children should be taught critical thinking at school?
In fact, that is what we argue for, is that children to be taught evidence, so that they can decide for themselves, so they can figure out for themselves what is truth.
Right. Do you understand what I was saying when I was explaining about natural selection requiring individual variation?
I do, but I also come back and I haven't heard you answer whether you have a problem with this idea of God being involved in the creation of each individual human being, not just perhaps being the one that got it all started.
Well, I do have a problem with that, because I've seen the evidence, and I know that individual variation comes from genetics, it comes from DNA, and I know where it comes from. And it's a very well worked out story. It's in every textbook. I mean, we differ because we have different genes.
And do you
genes. Sorry, go on.
Do you believe in a spirit or a soul?
I believe in a spirit or a soul in the sense of my own consciousness, which is a manifestation of my neurons and my brain physiology. I don't believe I have an immortal soul, no, but that's my personal belief.
And what about a disabled person who severely mentally disabled and is not able to make choices? Do they have a spirit? Are they a human being?
They're a human being. They belong to the species Homo sapiens. Their ancestry is Homo sapiens, so of course they're human beings, yes.
And do they have a spirit or a soul?
It's not a meaningful word. I mean, they have a spirit or a soul in just the same sense as I have, but I only have a spirit or a soul in a very much different meaning than your meaning.
The way I understood you to say it, it's because of your conscious, or even your consciousness, which would be different things. But for someone, though, who is not capable of making decisions, do they have a spirit or a soul?
Well, if you mean somebody whose brain is so disabled that they have no consciousness at all, then they have no consciousness. I've answered your question.
Well, no, because a spirit or a soul is different.
That's your word. It's not a word that I acknowledge or recognize as a meaningful word.
Then from what I understand you're saying, then if someone does not have the ability to be conscious, then they would not have a spirit or soul.
A human placenta is a identical twin to the baby that it nourished. I don't think either of us would wish to say that it has a spirit or a soul because it doesn't have a brain.
So if only a being that has a material, well, let me back up on that. It's the material, the matter, the brain, or the consciousness. Like, well, let me back there because those are two separate things. I guess I'm confused in what you're saying, that a brain means you have a soul. A consciousness means you have a soul, but someone whose brain is not functioning, would they then not have a soul?
Someone who didn't have a brain that was capable of consciousness, somebody who was a human vegetable in effect, would not have the properties that you call a soul and that I might call a soul for the sake of argument, but I don't think it's immortal. That's the main difference between us.
And I think that's very key, because that then would work out in how you and I, or someone who believes like you do and someone who believes like I do, would treat someone who is in what's been called I think it's a horrible term, but a vegetative state. That we would still treat that human being as a person who's deserving of loving respect, that should be fed and cared for, even though they can't for themselves.
How would you treat a chimpanzee who was in full command of her faculties?
Yes, and that's where we would differ. We believe that human beings have souls, have spirits, and that animals should absolutely are cared for. That's a great teaching that comes from our beliefs that we care for animals. But we recognize that there's a difference between animals and humans, and one of the differences is a spirit.
Wendy, you use the word "we" quite often for people who think like you. So would it be right that the CWA is part of a sort of wider constituency within America?
Yes, we represent 500,000 ourselves, but that's just a drop in the bucket of the number of people who believe similarly. And we find that as these challenges come up, say in school districts, that there are a number of parents and families and communities who will rise up in concern over the fact that only evolution is allowed to be taught, and not the questioning of evolution. So it's quite widespread in the United States. The belief that human beings are distinct is a widespread belief in the United States. And that's remarkable, because evolution has been so heavily taught in the last number of decades. And the fact that it's being taught so strongly and isolated from other information or evidence, and yet many people continue to believe that God has a hand in creating us, I think helps to show that people are using their critical factories. They're not just believing what's being taught in the schools, and that evolutionism is going to continue to have a bit of a challenge here in the United States and beyond.
I've been reading your website, and I get the feeling there's almost a feeling of sort of persecution. I mean, as though somehow you feel that the establishment in the United States is against Christianity. That puzzles me a bit, because, I mean, you know, you've got the White House, you've got the Supreme Court, you've got, well, you had both houses of Congress until quite recently. How can you feel persecuted in the face of this overwhelming Christian dominance in the United States?
many Christians have experienced the hostility toward our beliefs, but beyond hostility, the attempts to even censor and punish us for our beliefs.